chiedo al popolo italiano perché faccio pressione sul governo, lo chiedo, Pier, aiutami, per piacere fai vedere le foto.
أنا الصحفي حسن السيدي أحمد جواز سفر ألماني.
I think of you all and each of you every day.
I'm journalist in Libération. Please, help me.
Stop hiding behind the "I don't negotiate with terrorists" myth.
We, the British, are completely to blame, along with the Americans, for the situation in Iraq.
There was a knock at the door, and everybody froze. I never forgot what that feeling was like, and I still get a kind of a sick feeling, down the back of my spine when I remember.
We were all blindfolded and chained. The guards were rough, fairly violent. Slapped us around, beat on us. They didn't torture me. They interrogated me.
My life was in danger. They made several attempts to get hold of me. I had to go into hiding for about 3 weeks, together with my wife and 3 children.
We were put in solitary, and we were allowed out for half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the evening. You're completely unaware if anyone in the outside world knows that you've been captured.
What they did was blindfold me and tie my hands. I was then led up a hillside, and we had no idea if they were just going to execute us in the desert.
There have been a few times when I said to myself, this could be it. And you go deep within yourself and say, I've had a pretty good life, I've had my work, and then you converse with your God, and you say, okay.
A newspaper news editor, he said, I have the telephone number of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I wrote a letter. Somebody typed it and I faxed it to CPJ.
Can you just break down for, say, Asia, attacks on the press pages, for the 10 country summaries?
The Committee to Protect Journalists, located in New York City, receives dozens of calls each day regarding journalists in danger and handles hundreds of cases each year from around the world.
طيب احنا احتمال كمان نضطر نكلم وزارة الإعلام ونشوف ايه الأخبار هناك.
Oui, justement, je vous appelle à propos de...
Aparentemente en una entrevista que le dio a otro diario.
那你知道最近他
Filtrazione internet в Китае.
Comme ça, on peut commencer à voir qui travaille, qui fait quoi, qui...
Fortæl dig eller opdatere dig på, hvordan vi lancerer vores bog på den februar.
When I was a journalist in Mexico, the CPJ, I frankly found it something of an annoyance because somehow somebody at CPJ got my fax number, and 3 times a day, some enormous fax would come spitting out of my fax machine that would go on for pages. The mandate of this organization, what we do, is very clear. We exist to ensure that journalists everywhere are able to do their job freely. And I'm talking about individual journalists who put their lives and liberty on the line to report the news. And we want to ensure that that flow of information continues and that they know that they have the support of colleagues around the world when governments respond with violence and pressure.
Just about 90% of all the journalists killed in the world are local journalists covering local stories who, for whatever reason, gets together the courage to go up against the powers that be and pays the ultimate price. He gets killed. 90 to 95% of the journalists that we defend are local correspondents working in their own countries. And as a foreigner, you are acutely aware of your dependence on local journalists and the risk that they take to allow you to do your work. You show up in some town, you don't really know what's going on. What are you going to do? You're going to seek out the local journalists. And, those journalists I knew were taking a risk in providing me with information and working with me, and the risk was fairly extraordinary. You know, if you're reporting on the activities of the local drug cartels or human rights abuses committed by the military, and I was considerably less vulnerable, of course, because I was an international correspondent with accreditation.
Really keep it short and sweet. I mean, I don't want to send them 6 pages.
One of the things that makes international journalists safer is their visibility, and the fact that, you know, if anything happens to them, it immediately becomes an international incident.
Shaking with rage.
Ultimately, what we strive to do is give the local journalist the same level of visibility that an international correspondent would have. The media is notified, the government is aware that there's an international outcry, and there's also simply collegial support for people around the world doing the same job that we do as journalists without the same level of protection.
A really quick investigation.
The defense of this influential person, oftentimes a police officer or a senior government official, resorts to legal stalling tactics, which can attenuate a case for years and years and years, oftentimes, we believe, designed to break the will of the witnesses that have risked their lives and livelihoods to testify in these cases.
The second area of policy we're looking at.
CPJ is effective. And by God, it's satisfying to go someplace and talk to the prime minister or the president or the justice minister or the speaker of the house and say, you need to let these people free. You put them in jail because you want to shut them up. Well, you can't shut us up. We're going to be more trouble than they were. Sometimes that works.
It worked in the case of Alcibiades González del Valle, a Paraguayan journalist who was visiting New York in 1980 when a warrant for his arrest was issued by his government. Although he faced certain imprisonment, González decided to return to Paraguay to face the charges and have his voice heard. It was González's case that led to the creation of the Committee to Protect Journalists.
In 1980, Latin America was the worst place to be a journalist. The military regimes that ruled in much of the continent really had no compunction in arresting, killing, and disappearing journalists.
You want to get out? No, let's get right in here. You get nasty. Let them see the camera.
You had Nicaragua, where a U.S. correspondent for ABC, Bill Stewart, was killed in cold blood at a checkpoint by the Somoza regime.
Killed him.
In Argentina, dozens of journalists disappeared. Brazil, you name it.
While I was in Chile, I saw a neighbor get taken away by the secret police in the middle of the night.
Lori Nadell was a 32-year-old freelance reporter for the Associated Press.
When I started reporting on how many disappeared there were, I was told to report for an interview the general's office on Monday morning. I was kind of naive. I didn't realize the extent of the danger I was in until I got back to where I was staying. And the people said, we have to hide you now because, you know, if you show up, you'll be arrested. And if you don't show up, they're going to look for you. I managed to get out. But that continued to haunt me. The idea of living under the threat of being punished or imprisoned or forcibly detained or beaten up or tortured or possibly even killed because you're doing your job.
Nadell was a news writer at CBS when González's story caught her eye.
The story had merit, and I knew that it wasn't going to make the air. Human rights was not a popular subject at the time, but I thought perhaps a journalism magazine might be interested.
Lori Nadell wanted to write about this for the Columbia Journalism Review.
Michael Massing was a 28-year-old editor of the Columbia Journalism Review.
Alcibiades González del Valle seemed to embody for us both the threat to journalists and then just this incredible, personal courage to want to go back and stand up to them. And in the course of this, we became concerned not just about the article, but about the man's safety, because Paraguay was the type of place where he could go back and disappear and never be heard from again. And so he went back, and in fact, he was arrested. So we decided to just call around and find a group that would be able to sort of track him, and if anything happened, to create a stink so that there would be a price to pay for the government down there. But when we called around, we found there really wasn't any group that was set up to do this type of thing. And so we took it upon ourselves to improvise, and we notified the New York Times and the Associated Press and the State Department.
We had an electric typewriter and a desk that we used at the Alicia Patterson Foundation, and I remember spending many of my days off just writing, typing, actually. The good thing was they had correcting tape at that time, so you didn't have to retype the whole page if you made a mistake, which I thought was really great.
And there were a lot of articles written about it. And after a period of time, he was released. We were ecstatic. We suddenly thought, hey, maybe we hit on something. And so we began exploring the idea of setting up an organization. But how do you then build an organization that can move governments run by juntas and strongmen thousands of miles away? So we thought that the key thing to get some sort of traction and credibility is to set up a board. So we went to people who were well-known proponents of free expression, Victor Navasky and Anthony Lewis and Jane Kramer.
Coleman McCarthy from the Washington Post wrote a column, and it mentioned me as working for CBS News, and I was called into a vice president's office, and he basically said, "Who the hell are you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Am I going to get fired? Or is there something wrong?" I was really scared. He was very, he was very severe and stern. And he said, "Well, no, there's somebody here who's possibly interested in joining your organization. And, but he wanted me to check you out first." And he said, "So here's his name and his number," and it was Dan Rather.
It was my impression from her that they were quartered in a place just above a homeless shelter in Looks and Field. At any rate, they were having trouble paying the rent. They couldn't pay the rent. And so I asked her what it was, sort of holding my breath, saying, "I'm not Donald Trump." And she said, "Well, my recollection," she said, we've got to have $250. And so I breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Well, tell me what you do." And she gave me the vision. She laid it out. She said, "You've been a land correspondent for all these years, and you've traveled the world, and you know what these other journalists have to go through. Sometimes they're coerced, pressure is enormous, sometimes kidnapped, sometimes murder. You know, Dan. And they have no place to go for help." And that struck a chord with me, because it is true, having been a land correspondent for the better part of 20 years, I did know those things. I had seen those things, and like so many other journalists, had just pushed it out of my mind. But Laurie and Michael were thinking about it, and that impressed me. So I wrote her a check, I think, for $500.
He came to us. I mean, that was a huge morale boost, because we were there working away in obscurity, more or less, and suddenly one of the Paramount anchors in America came to us wanting to get involved, and so he, of course, immediately went on our masthead.
It was really Michael and Laurie against the world, and trying to convince at least the journalistic world that what they were into and up to was worth doing. But when I approached someone about possibly getting involved, they said to me, "Committee to protect journalists. What the world needs is a committee to protect people against journalists."
The biggest catch we could get would be Walter Cronkite. He was, of course, the most trusted, not only newsman, but man in America at that point.
Dan kind of gave us the green light to approach Walter, and was able to send our request through a CBS interoffice envelope from my desk to Walter's. And he called me on the interoffice phone. "This is Walter Cronkite." My boss was standing over me going, "Laurie, you have a call from Walter Cronkite." And everybody's standing, there's 30 people in the newsroom, and there's a dead silence.
Once we had Walter Cronkite and those of the other people I mentioned, we were off and running. We had no money, but we had stationery. That was our most precious research, our stationery with the letterhead on it. And it's interesting how much you can do with a letterhead, you know. People don't realize it's sort of like a Wizard of Oz thing, that there might not be that much behind the curtain. But a key moment in the committee's history came when the 3 British journalists got seized in Argentina during the Falklands War. One of them was Simon Winchester.
I knew we were in real trouble when we were formally charged with espionage and sentenced to an indeterminate period in prison. And then we were put in the police headquarters, and there we remained. I knew the stories of the things that had happened to people, being dropped out of airplanes and all that sort of stuff. And I must admit, I was worried at that point. All 3 of us were.
We thought, what can we do about it? I mean, this was a known case. This wasn't some local journalist in one of these countries that no one knew about. These were people who worked for the Times of London, the Observer, I believe. And we had this idea that, well, these news organizations are obviously going to leave no stone unturned in trying to get their own people out of prison, and they didn't. So we activated our network, which we had a mailing list maybe of 200 or 300 names at that point. And I'll never forget, like, carrying these boxes of letters and putting stamps on them. And then these letters began arriving down in Buenos Aires in these ministries.
It's difficult to quantify how important it is to receive a letter when you're in prison from an organization like this, like the CPJ. And Cronkite himself, it was something I didn't know about the existence of the CPJ, which of course was a very young organization then, so it's reasonable I'd never heard of it, and when I lived in Washington, it didn't exist. But Cronkite, we knew what he stood for, and the fact that he wrote this letter saying, I represent this organization which is designed specifically to protect people like you who get into trouble for no better reason than that you're seeking to tell the truth. So I'm on your side, and we're doing everything we can to help you. I felt an enormous sense of relief. I mean, I'm not given to tears, but I think at that moment I was very close to tears.
Of course, these ministers had no idea that we were like, you know, 2 or 3 people in an office in New York typing these things up and sending them off. I mean, again, it was a Wizard of Oz idea when they had no idea what was behind the curtain.
I thought the big guns are now involved, and I felt Uncle Walter's on my side, and everything's going to be all right, as indeed it was.
Within a couple weeks, they were released, and we were, of course, overjoyed. That was one of our first tastes of what this small operation could do to sort of move very powerful forces in other parts of the world.
I've given everyone a copy of the very, very preliminary plan for 2011. It's extremely ambitious. What I wanted to do was to...
What began as 2 young people with a typewriter is today a global organization with a full-time staff of more than 25.
Last year, we had a journalist die in custody. We had one of our early IPFA winner who died as well.
Program coordinators responsible for all the regions of the world cover Asia, Europe and Central Asia, Africa, the Middle East, North America, and all of Latin America.
At some point in the second or third quarter of the year, we'll be doing a big reporting mission to Iraqi Kurdistan.
In addition, they now have programs providing emergency and long-term assistance.
This brings me to journalist assistance, where our biggest workload came from last year, and what we're hoping to do...
But in the early days, no one imagined that the CPJ would have such a large and effective operation. The first delegation they sent was to Central America in 1982. It was a mission that almost ended the committee before it really began.
The committee went through a lot of tough points early on where our actual existence was in question because we were trying to figure out our methodology. And nobody had really done this type of work before in terms of a group that was specifically oriented toward press freedom around the world. And with journalism, you had this whole question of objectivity, and you don't want to be seen if you begin doing something that's very critical of the U.S. government. We had these people on our letterhead who needed to report the news and maintain a public image or a reality that they were not partisans of any side.
There is among journalists, and I would include myself in this, is on the one hand wanting to do nothing that will undercut your credibility. And one of the fears is that your reporting will give someone of very committed and passionate political or ideological persuasion an opportunity to hang a sign around your neck. Leftist, socialist, maybe even communist. Here in 2011, you say, well, that may be a little strong. But in the aura, the atmosphere of the early 1980s, this was a real and present danger.
We thought we would inoculate ourselves by having a broad span of people, you know, so if you had left and right together, it would sort of like then gain credibility with all parties. But in fact, it created an atmosphere in which we were sort of battling as much on the delegation as we were with the sort of authorities who we were seeking to influence.
I think I was 26 years old, and I was staffing the mission, so I helped set up appointments, and I was the interpreter. But I had a very, very personal reason for getting involved with the Committee to Protect Journalists. When I was in El Salvador, I started chatting with a photographer from one of the local papers, and we went out for coffee. I flew back to Washington, where I was living, and that week I opened the newspaper and saw that he and his editor had been kidnapped from a coffee shop in El Salvador the day before and disemboweled and then killed. I understood that people died in wars, but when you see people that you work with, you work alongside them, you have meals with them, and they're killed by death squads quite intentionally, quite brutally. You take it personally.
The problem was that what was going on in Guatemala and El Salvador was on an order of magnitude worse compared to what was going on in Nicaragua. And the government that we're supporting, journalists are getting killed.
A murder is something that you document, it's an event, and it involves a sense of outrage. But when left-wing governments took measures against the press, it did not tend to be murders, and it was more systemic. And it would involve more self-censorship and forms of quiet control, which are not as sensational, they're harder to document. That's what went on in Nicaragua. It wasn't that the Sandinista government was murdering journalists, it was not. And forces connected to the Salvadoran government were. So you had murders versus not murders.
That could then create a perception, that if some people wanted to use it, they could say that, they're being tougher on one government than the other. And some people in our group wanted to make more general statements about U.S. policy in the region, and certain statements got into our final declaration that did not respect the line that we should have drawn. And I said something about it at the press conference we had.
Michael wouldn't sign on to everything. It was a matter of conscience with him, and we all understood that. But the miracle is the CPJ somehow got through all these shoals, these minefields, if you will, and came out the other end with his credibility intact.
We had to remain true to our mission. We couldn't become an overtly political organization. There were lots of passions around that table when the board would meet. And I said, our job is to protect journalism.
I think the main lesson of our first mission was that you cannot get distracted by peripheral issues of politics and U.S. policy in general, that you have to keep the focus on press freedom and the protection of journalists.
When I became director, I became a total madwoman about pushing methodology. I wanted methodology handbooks. I had staff meetings where we talked about methodology and kept saying, okay, how do we make sure that we're developing even-handed standards and really looking at cases from a freedom of expression perspective and not from an ideological perspective. It was a challenge, but I think we made huge progress.
Since then, CPJ has sent more than 100 delegations to dozens of nations around the world, the guiding principle being the protection of journalists, no matter what their political, ideological, or social status.
Yeah, hi, Mohammed. I want to talk to you about that alert that you wrote from Gabon. What are you going to do with it?
But that leads to an ongoing question that the committee has continually faced. who exactly is a journalist? Take the case of Andre Mba Obami. In Gabon, Africa, Obami ran for president and lost. After 2 years of appealing the election results, he gave up and simply staged his own swearing-in and broadcasted on his own television station, which the government promptly shut down.
If a politician stages a mock swearing-in because he's upset that he wasn't voted in as president and puts it out on his own TV channel, and then that gets closed down, that's definitely a freedom of expression issue. I just wonder whether it was actually journalism. Was he committing journalism, putting himself out on his own TV station? That's the question.
Journalism is very hard to define in the abstract, but when you actually look at it, you know, if you're a journalist, that this is journalism. And if you apply that standard, it's actually a fairly straightforward question. That doesn't mean we don't have discussions and debates and disagreements in some instances.
Is it like pornography? You know it when you see it? Maybe. But there is no physics in which you can apply to it. X minus Y equals to the second factor a legitimate journalist or an illegitimate journalist. I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
We're not really here to judge the quality of the journalism. We're certainly not here to only support journalism that we agree with.
Even propaganda in certain circumstances, it's very, one person's propaganda is, we try not to make judgments about that because they're very subjective.
Sometimes I would joke with the staff, this week it feels like we're the committee to protect bad journalists.
The place where we always draw the line, and we're very clear about this, is incitement to violence. Incitement to violence is not protected by international law. Those who engage in incitement to violence are not journalists, and they don't qualify for the protection of CPJ.
The question of where that line is drawn became urgent in Yugoslavia during the 1990s, when state-run news outlets were fanning the flames of ethnic cleansing and fomenting violence.
With Yugoslavia, it was very much a steady drumbeat of cases of journalists being targeted and used as pawns in the military efforts.
This broadcast by Radio Television Serbia stirred nationalist sentiments by showing the remains of Serb victims of World War II and increased hostility towards Bosnian Muslims with images of corpses who allegedly had died at their hands.
I think the war in Yugoslavia was a wrenching period for CPJ because the debate over the role of state media and the violence that was taking place was very complex and very troubling. And the question was, did this cross over into incitement, or was it, creeping right up to the line? Were there instances where a relationship could be established between the broadcast of this material and specific acts of violence, and in which case we would certainly not defend it. In fact, we would abhor it.
In the former Yugoslavia, there had been many reports of mass murders, but nothing to compare with what David Rode found near Srebrenica.
I was the first reporter to find mass graves on the ground that confirmed the stories that had been told by survivors, the scale of the stories. And it was exactly as they described. Earlier in that day, I found, executions and a mass grave near a school and a set of railroad tracks. I mean, everything was exactly how these survivors had described to me. It was dangerous, but it helped prove that 8,000 people had been executed. And that, for that kind of story, I think it's worth taking risks. But at the second mass grave, I was arrested by a Bosnian Serb, a watchman. It was at this large earthen dam where they had carried out executions. I had only been there just a matter of seconds. I was actually pulling out a camera to take a picture of it to have proof when someone shouted, and I turned, and there was a man standing up on top of the dam with a rifle aimed at me. And he sort of screamed, don't move, and I did what I was told. They claimed that I was maybe trying to help NATO target that dam. I think they knew, in fact, what I was there for. And but they sort of played this game, and CPJ played an incredible role in pressuring the Serbs to release me, particularly Kati Martin.
Press freedom is pretty much in my bloodstream. I'm the child of two journalists who were jailed when I was a little kid in Cold War Budapest, and my parents had been accused of being CIA agents merely because they were doing their job as tough-minded reporters, which in the Cold War was punishable by jailing if you were on the Soviet side. And I was chairwoman when the Civil War broke out in the former Yugoslavia. And that's when I really switched into high gear, as CPJ did.
We were basically kept in the cell 23 hours a day. They kept me up all night. They didn't let me sleep. And they were much more focused saying, you're a spy, you know, and they kept having me tell my story over and over again. How had I crossed? Where had I gone that day? What was I doing? Was I really a journalist or not? And the sleep deprivation was clearly designed to try to get me to to break me, to get me to, you know, make a mistake.
When David was taken prisoner by Karadic's people, I happened to be at Wright-Patterson Airfield where the Dayton Accords to end the war were taking place. And since I had good lines open to the man who was running those peace talks, namely Richard Holbrooke, my husband, I was able to say, look, you've got to give me a chance to talk to Milosevic, whose ally Karadic was, about David, because this is going to become a huge story and a huge embarrassment for Milosevic. And Richard went to Milosevic and he said, we're calling a halt to the peace talks. Release David Rode, or there will be no peace talks.
And Milosevic responded, you would really do this for one journalist? And Holbrooke said, absolutely. I mean, he was a master, you know, manipulator and negotiator, and, you know, it worked.
Milosevic caved. Milosevic, who actually was running the show, prevailed on Karadic, one of the world's greatest war criminals, now in custody, that he had to let this correspondent go because he was jeopardizing the peace talks.
One morning, they walked into the cell I was in with these other prisoners and just said, come with us. And actually, Bosnian Serb TV came and did a forced interview where I stood up and said there was no evidence of the executions, and you know, and then I was, you know, I just wanted to get out, and so I made those false statements under duress. And this official arrived from Serbia who spoke fluent English and was very sophisticated and very well dressed, and he told me in the car, you know, you're very lucky they didn't kill you. And then we got in a helicopter after we'd crossed into Serbia itself, and I started to learn about this incredible effort that CPJ and particularly Cotty Martin had made on my behalf.
David's reporting had enormous impact. It really shamed the West, but we lost a great many colleagues, particularly in Sarajevo, but also in other battles such as Vukovar. It was a war, however, that could still be covered by journalists, because journalists still had some kind of standing. We were still dealing with chains of command and with authority and people that you could negotiate with and that you could put pressure on. Today, there are no rules.
The terrorist attacks of 9/11 changed forever not only the nature of war, but what it means to be a war correspondent. 4 months later, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal named Daniel Pearl was kidnapped in Pakistan while reporting on Al-Qaeda.
Danny was a young reporter with a great track record. He already established himself as one of our outstanding journalists, someone who I had the highest regard for and expected him to accomplish even more great things.
As managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, Paul Steiger was responsible for all its news coverage and was Daniel Pearl's boss.
I was about to meet with the journal's top editors from around the world, and this message was passed to me that he was missing. And the longer the time went by, the more of a sinking feeling we got. And it wasn't too long before a message was delivered that had a proof-of-life picture of Danny clearly in captivity. And very quickly, I was approached by CPJ and Ann Cooper, who was the executive director, with ideas for what we could do to try to help get the word out that Danny was not an anti-Islamic, anti-Pakistan, anti-anybody kind of reporter, that his reporting had always been straight up, that he'd angered the American government with some of the exposés he had written. And we tried to get on the air and in print people with strong Islamic credentials and credibility to say, you know, this was not some kind of CIA operative or American spy or even an opinion reporter who advocated wiping out the insurgency. He was simply a seeker for truth, and that they would be doing their own cause ill service by bringing harm to him, and the best thing for everybody would be to let him go. Some time passed. It was a matter of days or a couple of weeks, I don't remember exactly. But then I was on my way to Washington for some kind of event, and I was at LaGuardia Airport, and I got a call that said Danny was dead, that John Bussey had seen his body, and it was Danny, and he was gone.
Journalists are under attack now in a way that they weren't 20 years ago. They are targets. Look at Danny Pearl, one of the most careful journalists around. They went after him deliberately. They intended to kill him from the beginning, to make a statement, to make a political statement. It has become an extremely dangerous profession.
The murderers of Daniel Pearl beheaded him and then posted a video of it on the internet.
The threats to journalists have increased as the number of sort of failed states have increased. Militants who have a safe haven somewhere don't feel any pressure, you know, and want to defy sort of, you know, international norms. They want to seem, you know, terrifying, frankly.
I remember when I first landed in the Middle East in the 80s, one of the first things that I was taught was in Arabic to say, I am an American journalist. And that was a protective shield, an American journalist. That, of course, is no longer the case.
Journalists kind of had a, you know, get out of jail free card. You know, they could talk to anybody, and you know, they were valuable to everyone, and you could make the argument, hey, you know, I'm here to tell your side of the story, so, you know, you should talk to me. Well, that all changed with the development of the internet.
Now they can go on the internet. They don't need a journalist who comes and does television films or puts a story in a worldwide circulation newspaper or magazine. So the risks to journalists have increased tremendously, and the internet's a big part of that.
I want to talk about the Internet Advocacy Plan. This is the first time that we've been able, at this stage of the year, to incorporate an Internet strategy into our planning, and it's very exciting.
The problems posed by the Internet go well beyond its use as a tool of terrorism.
To be in contact with
the largest group of jailed journalists, they're online journalists, and it's well over 50% in China now. Those are the people most in the crosshairs of the government.
The future of journalism depends on keeping the internet free and open as a platform. Individual journalists who are using this platform face special risks, and you know, one example is Shirtao.
Shirtao was a mainstream journalist working in a small publication, one of tens of thousands of recipients of this daily stream of directives coming down from the Central Propaganda Department. As the anniversary of Tiananmen Square drew near, the Central Propaganda Department hands down directives of how you will report on the anniversary, how you will refer to the events. It's one of the sacrosanct parts of Chinese journalism that you don't talk about that, you don't talk about Taiwanese independence, you don't criticize the military, and you don't ever mention the Falun Gong. I mean, those are hard and fast rules. He took the directives and mailed them to a friend in New York, I think it was. To nail Schur, they finally had to seek the cooperation of Yahoo, And Chertow, using Yahoo as his email server, the same way you or I would, had mailed these things overseas, and Yahoo supplied that information to the government, which allowed him to be brought to trial, used as evidence in his prosecution, and he was given 10 years for sending state secrets abroad.
Chertow is only one of more than 100 cases the CPJ deals with every year. In addition to its Internet advocacy program, there's the long-standing Journalist Assistance Program, designed to help individual journalists in dire need.
In Taiwan, I got a little clarification on this from yesterday. It's a child welfare bill that's under consideration by the
When I came here in 1998, you never knew what was going to be facing you any day when you came in here at CPJ. One day I was the first person here. There was a Pakistani journalist standing outside the locked door. And I said, "Who are you and what do you want?" And he told me his name, which I instantly recognized because we had been putting out news alerts and protest letters about a case in Pakistan where the government was moving to arrest several editors, and he was one of them. And he had gone underground, gotten himself out of Pakistan and to the United States, and his first stop was us. You know, you'd get here and there might be somebody on the phone saying a journalist has been shot and there are some things that we could actually do to help, or, you know, literally somebody showing up on our doorstep or faxing us or emailing us and saying, you know, I need help and I need it right now. For example, one day we got a fax from a Sierra Leonean journalist named Arun Rashid Dean.
I started practicing journalism at a kind of advanced level when I joined the Sierra Leone Broadcasting Service in 1991. That was about the time that the war in Sierra Leone started. The rebel movement was fighting to overthrow the government of Sierra Leone, and they invited the rebel forces from the countryside to join forces with them. A lot of people were being killed. They launched what they called Operation No Living Thing. That was when they started, in a ferocious manner, attacking whatever they came across on their way back. People were being amputated. Freetown, the capital, was the only safe haven in the entire country. I was reporting on sports, but I also was reporting political developments, social developments.
And the bullet go inside here and stop in that way.
What they were doing was to airlift victims, particularly those who were being amputated, to the city. So I decided to lead a camera crew to the hospital. And then we started doing programs from the hospital, a weekly documentary on the siege. We'll go there, interview war victims, asking them who did what to them. And people were also able to see their family members who they may have thought may have died. They started seeing them, listening to the program. It was a popular program. But also the rebel forces were watching the program while they were in the bush. They were watching the programs and they didn't like what they were hearing from the victims because the victims were pointing fingers at them. So they made several attempts to get hold of me. So I had to go into hiding. That was when I really knew that they were after me. I remember two little boys came where I was hiding and they said, a rebel leader got hold of us and they told us to tell them where you were living. In fact, what happened was that they told us that if they failed to do that, they're going to kill them. And it became clear to me that I had to go. My life was in danger.
He sent this message to CPJ and explained briefly the situation. The program coordinator found out that he had a visa actually to come to the United States to cover the Special Olympics. Arun had been a sports reporter, but the country was consumed by civil war, so he got sent out to do other reporting, like, atrocities committed by the rebels in Sierra Leone. So we recommended that he come ahead on this visa to cover the Special Olympics.
Even though I was coming with a Special Olympic Games visa, I knew I was not going to cover the Special Olympic Games because the Games were over already. I was escaping some trouble in my country. I was escaping death at the hands of the rebel forces. I spoke to the lady who was the Africa coordinator at the time, and she said, we're working on something to get you out of Freetown immediately. Do you still have your visa? I said, yes. Within a week and a half, 2 weeks, I was out of Sierra Leone.
And when he got here, we helped him find a lawyer who would take the case for no money, and that lawyer helped Arun get political asylum here.
I arranged with the help of CPJ to get my wife and children out of Freetown, and they joined me here. But the thought occurred to me that I would not be able to do what I'm being used to be doing. I mean, reporting, going out, I mean, conducting those I used to love it. Conducting those interviews, I mean, doing all the sport reporting, you know. I knew, I mean, that has come to an end, you know.
From 1992 to 2011, 850 journalists have been killed while doing their jobs. Nearly 2/3 of them were murdered without any consequence for their killers.
Journalists are committed to the belief that a free and independent press is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. Why do journalists do it? Because we see it as a duty. We see it as a life's work. It's a calling. We do it because we think it matters.
To understand our surroundings, to know why things happen, to know why people do what they do, and to share that information with others, that is a basic human impulse. And it is such a powerful, powerful urge that governments have to expend enormous energy and creativity to suppress it. But as long as there's human society, there will be people who act on this urge and feel it so intensely that they will overcome whatever obstacles put in their path to do this.
There are journalists around the world who go to work every day, not knowing if they are going to be kidnapped or beaten or killed. And why do they do that? I've met journalists who've lost both legs to car bombs. I've met journalists whose every colleague has been in prison. I've met journalists who've been given 20-year sentences by their own government for telling the truth. Why do they do that? Because they know how important it is. You cannot have a free society without a free press. I believe that firmly. They believe it too.
CPJ means the Committee to Protect Journalists. But I think it goes far beyond that. It's about bringing a sense of security and responsibility to journalists. When journalists believe that there is a group out there, thousands of miles away, that cares about us in a very small, remote village, then there's that feeling that they have the responsibility, without fear, to go do what they're supposed to do, to bring the news to the public. That's what CPJ does. It makes journalists feel that they belong, that what they're doing is right. It urges them to think that they too have a responsibility not to be a sellout, not to cow into the threats of those who want to suppress them, not to give in, not to compromise,